A pregnant woman stands frozen in her living room. Her husband raises a wooden stick above her belly. His mistress watches from the stairs, smiling like she is watching a movie. He thinks no one will ever know. He thinks fear keeps her silent. He thinks he controls everything in this house. What he does not know, his wife has been planning her escape for 47 days. And tonight, three CEO brothers are about to walk through that door with evidence that will destroy his entire life. This is a story of betrayal, survival, and the most satisfying revenge you will hear this year. Stay until the end. Trust me, you do not want to miss how this unfolds. Drop a comment telling us where you are listening from. Let us begin. The security footage flickered on the screen with a timestamp that read, October 15th, 9:47 p.m. A pregnant woman stood in a marble-floored living room, her hands raised protectively over her swollen belly. Behind her, a man gripped a wooden walking stick, his knuckles white with rage. On the staircase, another woman watched with a smile that could only be described as entertained. This footage was never supposed to be seen. The man who installed those cameras thought he controlled everything in that house. The money, the doors, the locks, even his wife's voice. What he did not know was that his wife had been planning her escape for 47 days. And on this night, she would finally execute that plan. But first, she had to survive the next 3 hours. Let us go back, 47 days earlier. Carolyn Whitmore Calloway moved through her kitchen with the careful precision of a woman who had learned to be invisible. At 32 years old and 7 months pregnant, she carried herself with a quiet grace that most people mistook for submission. Her honey blonde hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. Her blue eyes, once bright with ambition, now carried a watchfulness that never quite relaxed. The Greenwich estate sprawled around her like a beautiful prison. 12,000 square feet of Italian marble, crystal chandeliers, and hand-carved moldings. Her father had gifted them this house as a wedding present 5 years ago. Back then, she had thought it was the beginning of a fairy tale. Now she knew better. Carolyn glanced at the security camera mounted in the corner of the kitchen ceiling. The small red light blinked steadily, always watching, always recording. Preston had installed the system 3 years ago, claiming it was for her safety. She had believed him then. She did not believe much of anything he said anymore. She pulled a leather journal from inside a hollowed-out copy of Pride and Prejudice on the bookshelf. The book had belonged to her grandmother. Preston never touched it. He did not read. He considered fiction a waste of time. Day 1, Carolyn wrote September 1st. He canceled my prenatal appointment again. Said Dr. Matthews was too expensive. We have $11 million in combined assets. I am beginning to document everything. The sound of tires on gravel made her freeze. She checked her watch. 4:32 p.m. Preston was not supposed to be home until 7. Her heart hammered against her rib as she shoved the journal back into its hiding place and smoothed her expression into pleasant neutrality. The front door opened with its familiar, heavy click. Footsteps echoed across the foyer. Not Preston's usual confident stride. These steps were faster, agitated, unpredictable. Caroline. Preston's voice cut through the house. Where are you, in the kitchen? She called back, keeping her tone light. Making dinner. He appeared in the doorway. Preston Calloway was 41 years old, with the square jaw and silver-touched temples that made other women swoon. He wore a charcoal suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. His dark eyes scanned the room with the assessing gaze of a man who cataloged everything he owned, including her. Why is there a charge on the credit card from that bookstore downtown, he asked. Carolyn kept stirring the risotto. I bought a pregnancy journal. The doctor recommended tracking my symptoms since the appointments have been... She paused carefully. Rescheduled. You do not need a journal. You need to rest. Preston crossed the kitchen and stood behind her. His hand landed on her shoulder. To anyone watching, it might have looked affectionate. Carolyn felt the pressure of his fingers, the subtle warning in his grip. You know I worry about you, about the baby. All this running around cannot be good for either of you. I only went to one store. One store today. Preston's fingers tightened. Last week it was the pharmacy. The week before that, lunch with some friend from college. You are 7 months pregnant. Carolyn, you should be home, safe, where I can take care of you. She forced herself to keep stirring. Of course. You are right. I will stay home. The pressure released. Preston kissed the top of her head with mechanical precision. Good. That is what I like to hear. He stepped back. I am going to shower before dinner. Something came up at work. I might need to take a call later. He left without waiting for her response. Carolyn listened to his footsteps ascending the stairs, then released the breath she had been holding. Her hands trembled slightly as she set down the wooden spoon. She was a graduate of Yale Law School. She had passed the bar exam on her first attempt. She had spent 4 years as a corporate attorney at one of the most prestigious firms in Manhattan before Preston convinced her to leave. For the baby, he had said. For our family. Now she could not buy a book without interrogation. Carolyn moved to the window and watched the autumn leaves drift across the manicured lawn. The gardener would be here tomorrow. The housekeeper, Mrs. Morrison, came 3 times a week. The pool maintenance crew arrived every Tuesday. All of them reported to Preston. All of them watched her. But not all of them were swagger to him. She pulled her phone from her apron pocket. Preston had installed tracking software on it months ago. She knew because she had found the app hidden in her settings. She left it there. Let him think she did not know. Her phone showed 6 missed calls from her oldest brother, Harrison, over the past week. She had not returned any of them. Preston monitored her call logs. She could not risk it. Not yet. Caroline finished preparing dinner in silence. She set the table with the fine china that Preston insisted upon, even for casual meals. She lit the candles that he said made the dining room feel more sophisticated. She arranged everything perfectly, because perfection was the only thing that kept him calm. When Preston descended the stairs in fresh clothes and damp hair, he surveyed the scene with approval. This is better, he said. This is what I wanted. A wife who understands her role. Carolyn smiled. It did not reach her eyes. Of course, darling. They ate in silence, punctuated by Preston's commentary on his real estate developments, his business rivals, his plans for expansion. Carolyn nodded at the appropriate moments. She asked questions that made him feel important. She played the role she had perfected over 5 years of marriage. But inside her mind, a different conversation was happening. 47 days, she thought. I need 47 days to gather enough evidence, to secure my finances, to find a way out that he cannot block. She touched her belly, feeling her daughter shift inside her. Preston wanted a son. He had made that clear. When the ultrasound revealed a girl, his disappointment had been palpable. He barely spoke to her for a week afterward. This baby would never know her father's disappointment. Carolyn would make sure of that. After dinner, Preston retreated to his home office for his conference call. Caroline cleaned the kitchen, checked the locks on all the doors, and climbed the stairs to their bedroom. She changed into her nightgown, brushed her teeth, and lay down on her side of the king-sized bed. At 11:15 p.m., Preston entered the bedroom. He did not speak to her. He changed in the walk-in closet, climbed into bed, and turned off his lamp. Within minutes, his breathing deepened into sleep. Caroline waited. 15 minutes. 30. An hour. When she was certain he would not wake, she slipped out of bed and padded silently down the hallway to the guest bathroom. The one room without cameras. Preston had deemed it unnecessary to monitor since no one ever used it. From behind the bathroom mirror, she retrieved a prepaid cell phone she had purchased with cash from a gas station 40 miles away. The phone had cost $39. It might save her life. She powered it on and opened the text message app. Her fingers hesitated over the keyboard. Once she sent this message, there was no going back. Preston would eventually find out. And when he did, she did not know what he would do. Her daughter kicked, hard, as if urging her forward. Caroline began to type. Harrison, I need your help. Do not react. Do not call my regular phone. Read everything I am about to send you. Then we plan. She hit send, the message delivered with a soft whoosh. 47 days. It was not much time, but it was enough. It had to be enough. 3 days after Caroline sent that first message, she found herself alone in the house for the first time in weeks. Preston had left for a meeting in Hartford that would keep him away until evening. Mrs. Morrison, the housekeeper, had finished early and gone home with a suspicious cold. The gardener was not scheduled until Thursday. Caroline stood in the hallway outside Preston's home office. The door was locked. It was always locked. He kept the only key on his person at all times. But locks were just puzzles. And Caroline had always been good at puzzles. She retrieved a thin piece of metal from her sewing kit, a skill she had learned from a YouTube video 3 weeks ago. Her hands trembled slightly as she inserted the makeshift pick into the lock. It took her 4 attempts. On the 5th try, something clicked. The door swung open. Preston's office smelled of leather and expensive cologne. Dark wood paneling covered the walls. A massive mahogany desk dominated the center of the room. Behind it, a wall of filing cabinets stood like sentinels guarding secrets. Caroline moved quickly. She did not know how much time she had. Preston sometimes came home early to check on her, to make sure she was behaving. She started with his computer. The screen demanded a password. She tried his birthday, their anniversary, his mother's maiden name, all rejected. Then she noticed the sticky note half hidden under his desk lamp. Written in Preston's cramped handwriting were 2 words: Legacy 2019, the year they got married, the word he used to describe everything he built. Caroline typed the password. The screen unlocked. What she found made her stomach turn. Emails to someone named Sloan Hartwell. Hundreds of them. The earliest dated back 3 years. The language started professional, then turned flirtatious, then explicit. They contained photos that Caroline wished she could unsee. But that was not the worst part. She clicked into a folder labeled Financial Planning. Inside were documents that made her legal training scream an alarm. Bank statements showing accounts she had never seen. Investment portfolios registered only in Preston's name. And there, buried among the spreadsheets, a single document that made her blood run cold. A loan agreement for $2.3 million. Collateral listed as the Greenwich estate. Her name nowhere on the paperwork. He had mortgaged their home without her knowledge. Carolyn's hands shook as she scrolled further. She found emails to an attorney she did not recognize. The subject line read, Post-Birth Custody Strategy. She opened it. The email outlined a plan to file for divorce immediately after the baby was born. Preston's attorney recommended claiming that Caroline suffered from postpartum psychosis. They would seek emergency custody of the child. They would freeze her access to all marital assets. By the time she recovered from childbirth, Preston would have full control of their daughter and their home and her family's trust fund. Caroline pressed her hand over her mouth to keep from screaming. 5 years. 5 years she had loved this man. 5 years she had excused his temper, his controlling behavior, his subtle cruelties. 5 years she had told herself that marriage required sacrifice. She had been sacrificing herself to a monster. Her phone buzzed. A text from Harrison on the burner phone. Got your documents. Bennett accessed the security footage remotely. We see everything. We are building a case. How much time do you need? Caroline typed back with shaking fingers. I found more. He is planning to take the baby. He forged loan documents on the house. I need to get copies of everything. She photographed every document, every email, every piece of evidence that proved Preston Calloway was not the successful businessman he pretended to be. He was a fraud, a manipulator, a thief, and she was going to destroy him. Her phone buzzed again, a different number this time. Bennett, her middle brother who ran one of the largest security firms on the East Coast. Caroline, the deed to your house. Check the county records. Something is wrong. She navigated to the county recorder's website. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she searched for the property records on their estate. The result made her gasp. The deed had been transferred. 3 months ago. The property now listed only one owner, Preston James Calloway. Her signature appeared on the transfer document, except Caroline had never signed anything. She stared at the screen, her vision blurring with tears. The signature was a good forgery, close enough to fool a casual observer, but Caroline knew her own handwriting. The loops were wrong. The pressure was inconsistent. Someone had copied her signature from another document and traced it onto this one. Preston had stolen her home. The front door opened downstairs. Caroline's heart stopped. She checked her watch. 2:43 p.m. Preston was not supposed to be back until 7. She had been so absorbed in her discoveries that she lost track of time. Caroline. Preston's voice echoed up the stairwell. I came home early. Where are you? She moved on pure instinct, closed the browser windows, logged out of the computer, grabbed the sticky note with the password and shoved it back under the lamp. She was out of the office in seconds, pulling the door closed behind her. praying the lock would catch. It did. She ducked into the guest bedroom just as Preston's footsteps reached the top of the stairs. "In here," she called out, trying to keep her voice steady. "I was just resting." Preston appeared in the doorway. His eyes swept the room, searching for something out of place. "Why this room? Why not our bedroom? The light is better in here," Caroline said. "The baby has been active." I could not sleep in the dark." Preston studied her for a long moment. Caroline forced herself to meet his gaze. To look innocent, to look stupid, to look like the obedient wife he believed her to be. "Finally, he nodded. "Fine, but next time, text me when you change locations. I worry when I cannot find you." "Of course. Darling, I am sorry. He turned and walked away. Caroline listened to his footsteps descend the stairs, then the sound of his office door opening and closing. She allowed herself exactly 3 seconds to breathe. Then she reached into her pocket and felt the burner phone. The evidence was saved to the cloud now. Bennett had set up an automatic backup that Preston could not access or delete. The countdown continued. 44 days. That night, Carolyn lay in bed beside her husband and listened to him breathe. The same breath she had found comforting when they were newlyweds now made her skin crawl. He was planning to take her daughter, to have her declared mentally unfit, to steal everything she had and leave her with nothing. But Preston had made one critical mistake. He had underestimated her. He saw a pregnant woman who gave up her career, who stayed home, who cooked his dinners and pressed his shirts and smiled at his business partners. He forgot that before she was his wife, she was Caroline Elizabeth Whitmore, daughter of a federal judge, sister to 3 CEOs, graduate of Yale Law School. She was not a victim. She was a survivor. And survivors fought back. The next 3 weeks passed in a careful choreography of deception. Caroline smiled at Preston over breakfast. She kissed him goodbye when he left for work. She played the role of dutiful wife with an Oscar-worthy performance while secretly building the case that would destroy him. Every Tuesday and Thursday, when Mrs. Morrison came to clean, Caroline found ways to speak with her privately. The elderly housekeeper had worked for the Callaways for 2 years. She saw everything. She said nothing. But Caroline had noticed the way the older woman flinched when Preston raised his voice, the way her eyes lingered on the bruises Caroline tried to hide beneath long sleeves. On a Thursday afternoon in late September, Caroline decided to take a risk. "Mrs. Morrison," she said quietly, watching the housekeeper fold laundry in the upstairs hallway, "can I trust you?" The older woman's hand stilled on a pillowcase. Her gray eyes, weathered by decades of life, met Caroline's with unexpected intensity. "That depends on what you are asking. I am asking if you see what happens in this house. Really see it?" Mrs. Morrison set down the pillowcase. She glanced toward the security camera at the end of the hall, then back at Caroline. "The cameras do not record audio in this hallway. Only video. I checked." Caroline blinked. "You checked 3 months ago, when I saw the bruise on your neck. The one you told him came from a curling iron." The admission hung in the air between them. Caroline felt her throat tighten. She had been so careful to hide that bruise, so certain no one had noticed. "Why did you stay?" Caroline whispered. "Why did you not say anything?" Miss Morrison's expression shifted. Something old and painful surfaced in her eyes. "Because I know what happens to women who speak too soon, who act before they are ready. I watched my sister make that mistake 50 years ago." "Your sister," the older woman nodded slowly. "She was married to a man like Mr. Calloway, charming in public, a monster behind closed doors. She tried to leave him once, packed a bag in the middle of the night, got halfway to our mother's house before he caught her." Mrs. Morrison paused. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up the pillowcase again. "He killed her, made it look like an accident, drove her car off a bridge and told the police she was unstable. Suicidal. They believed him because he was a respected businessman and she was just a hysterical woman." Caroline felt tears sliding down her cheeks. She did not try to stop them. "I am so sorry. Do not be sorry," Mrs. Morrison said firmly. "Be smart. Be patient. Be ready." She looked directly at Caroline. "I have watched you these past weeks. The hidden phone, the late-night visits to the guest bathroom, the way you photograph things when he is not looking. You know I know. And I am telling you that whatever you are planning, I want to help." Caroline stared at the woman who had cleaned her floors and washed her windows for 2 years, a woman she had barely spoken to beyond pleasantries, a woman who had been carrying her own grief, her own guilt, her own desperate need for justice all along. "My brothers are building a case," Caroline said quietly. "Legal documents, financial fraud, evidence of abuse. We are planning to leave in about 3 weeks. I need to get through Thanksgiving. He will be distracted with business." Mrs. Morrison nodded. "The security system. Your brother installed it. Did he not, Bennett Whitmore?" "Yes, he still has remote access. Preston does not know." "That is good. But there is something else you should know." Mrs. Morrison lowered her voice even further. "That woman, the one who calls the house when you are at your appointments. I have seen her car in the driveway when you are gone." Caroline's stomach dropped. "What woman? Blonde, tall, drives a red Mercedes?" Mr. Calloway meets her at the side door, takes her to the guest cottage. The affair. Carolyn had known about it from the emails, but hearing it confirmed out loud made it real in a different way. "How long? At least a year. Maybe longer." Mrs. Morrison's jaw tightened with disapproval. "She looks at this house like she already owns it, like she is measuring the drapes." "Her name is Sloane Hartwell," Caroline said. "She works with Preston, I know. I also know that she has no idea what she is getting into. Men like Mr. Calloway do not change for other women. They just find new victims." Caroline wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. She felt wrung out, exhausted, but beneath the exhaustion, something else stirred. "Hope. Will you help me?" she asked. "When the time comes," Mrs. Morrison reached out and squeezed Caroline's hand. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "When I could not save my sister, I made a promise. I swore I would never stand by and watch another woman suffer the same fate. So yes, Mrs. Calloway, I will help you, whatever you need." The two women stood in the hallway, connected by a shared understanding that transcended employer and employee, connected by the knowledge of what men like Preston were capable of, connected by the determination to stop him. Carolyn took a deep breath. "Then I need you to do something for me, something important." "Name it." "There is a number on my phone. My brother Cole. He runs a media company. When everything falls apart, when Preston realizes what is happening, he will try to control the story. He will paint himself as the victim and me as the crazy pregnant wife." Mrs. Morrison nodded slowly. "You want me to make sure the truth comes out. I want you to be a witness, on camera, if necessary." "I know that is a lot to ask." The older woman squared her shoulders. "For 50 years, I have carried the guilt of my sister's death. 50 years of wondering what would have happened if I had spoken up, if I had been braver." She met Caroline's eyes with fierce determination. "I am one hand on being silent." Caroline felt something shift inside her chest. For months, she had felt alone, isolated, trapped in a prison of Preston's making. But she was not alone. She had her brothers. She had evidence. And now she had a witness who understood exactly what was at stake. 23 days. Carolyn said, "Can you hold on for 23 more days, Mrs. Morrison?" smiled grimly. "Honey, I have been holding on for 50 years. 3 more weeks is nothing." The Tuesday before Thanksgiving. Preston came home early. Caroline heard his car in the driveway at 2:15 p.m., nearly 5 hours ahead of schedule. Her hands froze over the laptop where she had been organizing evidence files. Something was wrong. She closed the laptop and slid it beneath the couch cushion. Then she arranged herself in a picture of domestic tranquility. A pregnancy book open in her lap, a cup of herbal tea steaming on the side table. Preston burst through the front door. His face was flushed. His tie hung loose. Carolyn had never seen him so agitated. "Did you talk to them?" he demanded, striding into the living room. "Did you tell them?" Caroline kept her expression neutral. "Tell who? What? Your brothers? Did you tell them about my finances?" Her heart hammered, but she forced confusion into her voice. "I have not spoken to my brothers in weeks. You know that. You check my phone every night." Preston paced across the room. "Someone has been asking questions. My accountant called this morning. He said a law firm reached out requesting financial disclosures. A law firm that represents the Whitmore family trust." Caroline shook her head slowly. "Harrison manages the trust. Maybe it is routine, an audit or something." Preston stopped pacing. He turned to face her with narrowed eyes. You expect me to believe this is a coincidence? Your family suddenly starts investigating my finances 2 months before the baby is due. I do not know what to tell you. Carolyn kept her voice steady. I have been home. You track my location. You monitor my calls. How could I possibly be involved? For a long moment, Preston stared at her. Carolyn felt his gaze like a physical weight, pressing down on her, searching for cracks in her composure. She did not blink, did not fidget, did not give him anything to latch onto. Finally, he exhaled. Maybe you are right. Maybe it is routine. He ran a hand through his hair. I need to make some calls. Stay here, Hesseyo. He disappeared into his office. The lock clicked behind him. Caroline counted to 60. Then she pulled out the burner phone from its hiding place inside her boot. He knows someone is investigating. She typed quickly. He thinks it is the family trust. He does not suspect me yet. What happened? Bennett's reply came almost immediately. Our attorneys filed a routine inquiry with his accountant. Standard due diligence. We did not think he would find out this fast. Can you pull back? Give him time to calm down. Too late. Harrison already filed a petition with the county recorder challenging the fraudulent deed transfer. Preston will be served notice within 48 hours. Caroline's blood ran cold. That changes everything. I know. We are accelerating the timeline. Can you get out tomorrow? She thought about the locks on the doors, the security cameras, the way Preston monitored her every movement. Tomorrow is Wednesday. He works from home on Wednesdays. Then Thursday, we will have a car waiting at the end of the driveway. 9 a.m. Tell him you have a prenatal appointment. He canceled all my appointments. Then lie. Tell him you rescheduled without his permission. Let him be angry. By the time he realizes the truth, you will be safe with us. Carolyn stared at the message. Thursday, 2 days away, after months of planning, of documenting, of waiting, the end was finally in sight. Okay, she typed. Thursday at 9. She deleted the conversation and powered down the phone. Her hands were shaking. Her daughter kicked inside her belly, hard and insistent, as if she could sense her mother's fear. 2 more days, Carolyn whispered. Just hold on for 2 more days. That night, Preston was agitated through dinner. He barely touched his food. He checked his phone constantly, typing furious responses to messages Caroline could not see. Twice he left the table to make calls in his office. Carolyn watched him and wondered what was happening. What conversations were taking place? What plans were being made? At 9:30, Preston finally spoke. I need to go to the office tomorrow, he said abruptly. Something came up. A deal that needs my attention. I thought you worked from home on Wednesdays. Not this week. He stood from the table and began clearing his plate. Actually, Sloan will be coming by in the afternoon. To pick up some documents, I need her to courier to Hartford. Caroline felt ice slide down her spine. Sloan is coming here. Is that a problem? No. Of course not. I did not realize you worked so closely with her. Preston's eyes flickered with something dark. She handles special projects. You would not understand. He left the room without another word. Carolyn sat alone at the dining table, surrounded by the remnants of a meal she could not remember eating. Sloan was coming to the house. Tomorrow. While Preston was supposedly at the office, it was not a coincidence. He was testing her, seeing if she would react, seeing if she would break. Carolyn cleared the table with mechanical precision. She washed the dishes, wiped the counters, turned off the lights. Then she climbed the stairs to the bedroom where her husband was already in bed, scrolling through his phone with the focused intensity of a man planning something terrible. She lay down beside him. She closed her eyes. She did not sleep. In the morning, Preston left at 7:30 without kissing her goodbye. Caroline watched his car disappear down the driveway, then counted to 300 before moving. She had roughly 12 hours before Sloan arrived. 12 hours to finish her preparations. 12 hours to secure her future. It was time. At 2:45 on Wednesday afternoon, Caroline heard a car pull into the driveway. She moved to the living room window and watched a red Mercedes park beside the fountain. A blonde woman emerged, all legs and confidence in designer clothes. Sloan Hartwell. Carolyn had seen her face in the photographs, had read her words in those emails, had imagined this moment 100 times, but nothing prepared her for the reality of watching her husband's mistress walk toward her front door like she owned the place. The doorbell rang. Caroline considered not answering, considered hiding in the bedroom and pretending she was asleep. But something stubborn rose up inside her, something that refused to cower any longer. She opened the door. Sloane's smile faltered slightly. She clearly had not expected Caroline to answer. "Oh," she said, recovering quickly. "Mrs. Calloway, Preston said you usually rest in the afternoons." He was mistaken. Caroline said coolly, "Can I help you? I am here to pick up some documents for the Hartford project." Sloane held up a leather briefcase as evidence. Preston said they would be in his office. "His office is locked." Sloane's smile tightened. "He gave me the code." "Of course he did." Caroline stepped aside and gestured toward the hallway. "It is the second door on the left." Sloane brushed past her without a thank you. Her perfume was heavy, cloying, obviously expensive. She walked through the house with the familiarity of someone who had been there many times before. Caroline followed at a distance. She watched Sloane enter the office code without hesitation, watched her disappear inside, watched her emerge 3 minutes later with a folder tucked under her arm. "Got what I needed," Sloane announced. She paused in the foyer, studying Caroline with undisguised contempt. "You know, you really should take better care of yourself. You look exhausted. Growing a human is tiring work." "I would not know." Sloane smiled. "Never wanted children myself. Too much sacrifice." "Too much." She waved her hand vaguely. "Domesticity?" Caroline felt her temper flare, but she kept her expression neutral. "To each their own." Sloane moved toward the door, then stopped. She turned back with a look that was almost pitying. "He talks about you sometimes." "Preston, do you know what he says?" Caroline said nothing. "He says you used to be interesting. Before," Sloane's smile sharpened. "But now you are just, what was the word he used? Convenient." The door closed behind her. Caroline stood in the foyer for a long moment, listening to the Mercedes start and pull away. Her hands were shaking. Her jaw ached from clenching. Convenient. That was what 5 years of marriage had reduced her to. A convenient wife. A convenient incubator for his heir. A convenient target for his cruelty. She pulled out the burner phone and typed a message to her brothers. She was just here. Sloane. In our house. Going through his office like she owned the place. Bennett replied first. "We know." The cameras caught everything, including her entering the office code. Including that, we have her face, her fingerprints on the doorframe, and audio of her conversation with you. She just made herself an accessory to fraud. Cole added his own message. When this goes public, she goes down with him. Her career, her reputation, everything. She picked the wrong side. Carolyn stared at the screen. For a moment, she almost felt sorry for Sloane. The woman clearly believed Preston loved her, believed he would leave Caroline and build a life with her. She had no idea she was just another pawn in his game. Then Caroline remembered the word. Convenient. Her sympathy evaporated. That night, Preston came home at 8:45. He seemed calmer than the day before. Almost pleasant. He kissed Caroline on the cheek and asked about her day. It was quiet, she said. Restful. Good. You need your rest. The baby will be here before we know it. They ate dinner together. Preston told stories about his day, about a difficult client, about a deal that was finally coming together. Carolyn nodded and smiled and played her part. At 10:30, they went to bed. Preston fell asleep almost immediately, exhausted from whatever schemes he had been executing all day. Caroline lay awake. Tomorrow was Thursday. Tomorrow, at 9 a.m., she would walk out the front door and never come back. She pressed her hand against her belly. Her daughter shifted, turned, settled. We are almost there, Caroline whispered. Just a few more hours. The hours crawled by. Midnight, 1 a.m., 2, 3. At 4:30, Caroline heard Preston's phone buzz. He grunted, rolled over, checked the screen. Then he sat up abruptly. What the hell? He muttered. Caroline kept her eyes closed, her breathing steady, her body motionless. Preston climbed out of bed and left the room. She heard him descend the stairs, then the sound of his office door opening and closing. Something had happened. Caroline waited 10 minutes, then carefully got out of bed. She crept to the top of the stairs and listened. Preston's voice drifted up from the office, muffled but audible. When did you receive this? This cannot be right. Check again. I signed that document myself. There is no way it could be challenged. A long pause, then she heard something that made her blood freeze. Find out if my wife talked to anyone. Check her phone records. Check her email. Check everything. If she is behind this, I will make her regret it. The office door slammed. Caroline retreated to the bedroom. Her heart was racing. Her plan was unraveling. He knew something was wrong. He was investigating. She grabbed the burner phone and typed frantically. He knows. He is checking my records. I cannot wait until 9. I need to leave now. Bennett's reply came in seconds. Get dressed. Pack nothing. Car will be at the end of the driveway in 20 minutes. We are coming. Caroline pulled on yoga pants and a sweater. She shoved her feet into sneakers. She did not pack a bag. She did not grab photos or jewelry or mementos. She grabbed only the phone and crept toward the stairs. Halfway down, she heard Preston's footsteps in the hallway below. Going somewhere. His voice was ice. Caroline froze. Preston stood at the bottom of the stairs, blocking the path to the front door. His face was twisted with rage. In his hand, he held her burner phone. He had found it. Did you think I was stupid? He asked quietly. His voice was more terrifying than any shout. Did you think I would not notice a second phone? Would not wonder why you have been sneaking around for weeks? Caroline gripped the banister. Her mind raced through options. The back door was through the kitchen. Too far. The windows were alarmed. Her brothers were 20 minutes away. She was trapped. Preston, she said carefully. Let me explain. Explain what? He began ascending the stairs slowly. Each step deliberate, predatory. Explain how you have been plotting against me with your brothers. Explain how you are trying to destroy everything I have built. You built it with fraud, with forgery, with stolen money. His jaw tightened. You do not know what you are talking about. I know about the loan, the 2.3 million. I know about the deed transfer. I know you forged my signature. Carolyn lifted her chin even as her heart pounded. I know everything. Preston, for a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, maybe even fear. Then it hardened into something darker. You should have kept your mouth shut, he said. You should have stayed in your place. My place, Caroline felt anger surge through her. My place is not being your prisoner. My place is not being a convenient wife for you to control and discard when you are done with me. Preston's hand shot out and grabbed her wrist. The same wrist he had grabbed before. The same wrist that still bore fading bruises. He yanked her forward, pulling her down 2 steps until their faces were inches apart. You are nothing without me, he hissed. Your family money, your law degree, your brothers with their fancy companies, none of it matters. You are mine. This baby is mine. This house is mine. Let go of me. Or what? He squeezed harder. Carolyn gasped as pain shot up her arm. What are you going to do? Carolyn, run. Hide, call the police, he laughed. A cold, cruel sound that echoed through the marble foyer. I know every cop in this county. I have judges in my pocket. Your brothers might have money, but I have connections that will bury you all. By the time I am done, you will be locked in a psych ward and I will have full custody of my daughter. Carolyn felt tears burn her eyes. Not from fear, from fury. She is not your daughter, she said through clenched teeth. She will never be yours. Preston's face contorted. His grip tightened to the point of agony. Then he released her wrist and shoved her backward. Caroline stumbled, caught herself on the banister, one hand flying to her belly. Get back to bed, Preston ordered. We will deal with this in the morning. I am leaving. No. He blocked the stairs again. You are not. The doorbell rang. Both of them froze. Preston's eyes narrowed. He moved down the stairs toward the front door, keeping Caroline in his peripheral vision. When he opened it, a police officer stood on the porch. Mr. Calloway. The officer was young, professional, clearly uncomfortable. We received a call about a domestic disturbance. There is no disturbance. Preston's voice transformed into smooth charm. My wife and I were having a disagreement. You know how pregnant women can be. Emotional. The officer looked past Preston into the house. Ma'am, are you all right? Caroline opened her mouth to speak. Preston's hand closed around the doorframe, his body blocking her from view. She is fine, just tired. I appreciate your concern. Officer, but we do not need any assistance. The officer hesitated. Sir, I would like to speak with your wife directly. That is not necessary. Actually, it is. The officer's voice hardened slightly. Step aside, please. For a moment, Carolyn thought Preston would refuse, would slam the door in the officer's face, would drag her upstairs by force. Then headlights swept across the driveway. 3 black SUVs pulled up behind the police cruiser. Doors opened. Men emerged. Harrison, Bennett, Cole, her brothers. Carolyn felt her knees go weak with relief. Preston turned and saw them. His face went pale. What the hell? He started. Harrison approached the door. His expression was calm, controlled, absolutely lethal. Good evening, officer. I am Harrison Whitmore. My sister called us about an emergency. The officer nodded. Are you the ones who contacted dispatch? And we are... Harrison looked past Preston to Caroline. His voice softened. Caroline, are you hurt? She shook her head. Just scared. You do not have to be scared anymore. Harrison turned back to Preston. Step away from the door. Preston did not move. This is my house. You are trespassing. Actually, Bennett said, joining his brother on the porch, this is not your house. The deed transfer you filed has been rejected by the county recorder. Fraudulent signatures. The property remains in Caroline's name. He smiled coldly. You are the one trespassing. Cole held up his phone. And just so you know, this entire conversation is being recorded. Every word you have said tonight, every threat, every admission. Preston's confident facade cracked. You cannot do this. We already have, Harrison said. Now step aside. We are taking Caroline home. For a long moment, no one moved. The officer watched warily, hand resting on his belt. Caroline gripped the banister, barely breathing. Her brothers stood like statues, unmoving, unyielding. Preston's shoulders slumped. He stepped aside. Caroline descended the stairs on shaking legs. She walked past her husband without looking at him, past the life she had built on lies, past the prison she had called home. When she reached the doorway, Harrison wrapped an arm around her shoulders. You are safe now. Carolyn leaned into her brother's strength. For the first time in years, she believed him. Behind her, she heard Preston's voice, thin with desperation. This is not over. Harrison did not turn around. Yes, it is. The Whitmore family estate sat on 50 acres of rolling Connecticut hills. It had been in their family for 4 generations. High stone walls surrounded the property. Security cameras monitored every entrance. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter around the clock. It was the safest place Caroline had ever known. For 3 days, she rested. She ate meals prepared by the family cook. She attended her first prenatal appointment in 2 months, where Dr. Matthews confirmed that both she and the baby were healthy. She slept in her childhood bedroom, surrounded by stuffed animals and faded posters from her teenage years. She began to believe it was really over. On the 4th day, Harrison called a family meeting in the study. The attorneys have been working around the clock. He explained, we have enough evidence to file criminal charges against Preston, financial fraud, forgery, domestic abuse. The county prosecutor is reviewing the case. Carolyn nodded. And the divorce already in progress. Given the circumstances, your lawyer believes we can push for an emergency decree, full custody of the baby, complete separation of assets. Harrison smiled grimly. By the time we are done, Preston will not have a penny to his name. Bennett leaned forward. The security footage from the house is devastating. Every argument, every threat, every time he grabbed you, all of it on video, Cole added. And when the news breaks, his business partners will abandon him. His investors will sue. His reputation will be destroyed. For the first time in months, Carolyn felt hope. Then her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen, a number she did not recognize, against her better judgment. She answered, Hello, Caroline. Preston's voice was smooth, controlled, almost pleasant. I hope you are enjoying your time with your family. Her blood ran cold. How did you get this number? I have my ways. Listen carefully. I want you to come home. Tonight, we can work this out. Put everything behind us. There is nothing to work out. I disagree. Preston's voice hardened slightly. You see, I have been making some calls, talking to some people, and I have learned something interesting about your family. Carolyn's heart began to race. What are you talking about? Your father, Judge Robert Whitmore. Preston's laugh was cold. Pillar of the community, paragon of justice. Except he was not always so upstanding. Was he? Carolyn felt the room tilt. Her father had passed away 5 years ago. He had been beloved, respected, mourned by thousands. I do not know what you are implying. No. Then let me be clear. I have evidence that your father accepted bribes during his time on the bench. Evidence that could destroy his legacy. Evidence that could drag your entire family through the mud. You are lying, am I? Preston paused. Come home tonight, Caroline. Drop the charges. Call off your brothers, and I will make this all go away. The line went dead. Caroline stared at the phone. Her hands were shaking. Her brothers watched her with concern. What did he say? Harrison demanded. Caroline swallowed. He says he has evidence that Dad accepted bribes. The room went silent. That is impossible, Bennett said finally. Dad was the most honest man I ever knew. I know, but Preston sounded certain. He sounded like he had something real. Cole ran a hand through his hair. It could be a bluff, a desperate attempt to regain control, or it could be true. Carolyn looked at her brothers. What if he is right? What if there is something we do not know? Harrison's jaw tightened. Then we deal with it. We find out the truth. But we do not let Preston use it against us. The meeting ended without resolution. Carolyn retreated to her room and sat on the edge of the bed, mind racing. Her father had been her hero, the reason she became a lawyer, the moral compass of her entire family. Could he really have been corrupt? She did not sleep that night. The next morning, the story broke. Not about her father, about her. Caroline stared at the television in horror as a news anchor read the headline. Wealthy heiress accused of mental instability, flees home during pregnancy breakdown. Preston had gone to the press first. The segment featured interviews with anonymous sources claiming Caroline had a history of erratic behavior, that she had threatened to harm herself and the baby, that Preston, the devoted husband, had been trying to get her help for months. There were photos, Caroline looking disheveled, leaving a pharmacy, Caroline crying in her car, Caroline looking through her window like a woman unraveling. He had been documenting her too. Caroline felt her world collapse. The phone calls started immediately. Reporters, former colleagues, people she had not spoken to in years, all wanting to know if the rumors were true. Her lawyers issued a statement denying everything. It did not matter. The damage was done. By the end of the day, Caroline's name was trending on social media. Half the comments called her brave, half called her crazy. Everyone had an opinion. And Preston, somehow, was winning. The first catastrophe came at 7:32 on a Tuesday morning. Caroline was eating breakfast in the Whitmore estate kitchen when she felt a sharp pain rip through her abdomen. She dropped her fork, clutched her belly, looked down to see a spreading stain of red on her white nightgown. Something was wrong with the baby. Mrs. Morrison, who had left Preston's employ and now worked for the Whitmores, found her on the floor. The ambulance arrived in 12 minutes. By the time they reached the hospital, Carolyn was barely conscious. The diagnosis was placental abruption. The stress of the past weeks had triggered a partial separation of the placenta from the uterine wall. The baby was in distress. Emergency surgery was required. Carolyn lay on the gurney as they wheeled her toward the operating room. The fluorescent lights blurred overhead. Doctors shouted instructions she could not understand. Someone squeezed her hand, told her everything would be okay. She was not sure she believed them. The surgery lasted 4 hours. When Caroline woke, she was alone in a hospital room. Machines beeped steadily beside her bed. An IV dripped medication into her arm. Her throat was raw from the breathing tube they had removed. The baby, she croaked. A nurse appeared at her bedside. Your daughter is in the NICU, Mrs. Calloway. She arrived 6 weeks early, but she is stable. Would you like to see her? Carolyn nodded. Tears streamed down her face. They brought her to the neonatal intensive care unit in a wheelchair. Her daughter lay in an incubator, impossibly small, wires and tubes connected to her tiny body. But she was alive, breathing, fighting. Carolyn pressed her hand against the glass. I am sorry, she whispered. I am so sorry. She named her Eleanor Grace. After her grandmother, after the woman who had taught her that strength came in many forms. The second catastrophe came 3 days later. Harrison arrived at the hospital with a grim expression. There is a problem. Caroline looked up from the chair beside Eleanor's incubator. What now? Preston's lawyers filed an emergency motion. They are claiming that your mental instability led to the premature birth. They want temporary custody of Eleanor once she is discharged. That is insane. I know. But they have a psychiatrist willing to testify that you exhibit signs of postpartum psychosis, that you are a danger to yourself and your child. I have not even left the hospital. How can I have postpartum psychosis if I have not been alone with my baby for 5 minutes? Harrison sat down heavily. They do not care about facts. They care about winning. And right now, Preston is throwing everything he has at this. The court date was set for the following week. Caroline spent every moment she could with Eleanor, trying to memorize her daughter's face in case they were separated. She pumped milk every 3 hours. She sang lullabies through the incubator glass. She prayed to a God she was not sure she believed in anymore. The third catastrophe was the worst. The night before the custody hearing, Caroline received a message from an unknown number. It contained a single photo. Her father, 30 years younger, accepting an envelope from a man in an expensive suit. The accompanying text read, "Drop the charges or this goes public tomorrow." Caroline stared at the image. The proof Preston had promised. The evidence that could destroy her family's legacy. She called Harrison. "I need to tell you something," she said. At 2 a.m., the Whitmore siblings gathered in Caroline's hospital room. She showed them the photo, explained the threat, waited for their reaction. "It does not matter," Cole said finally. "Of course it matters," Caroline insisted. "If this comes out, everything Dad built will be questioned." "Let it be questioned." Bennett's voice was firm. "We do not negotiate with monsters. If Dad made mistakes, we deal with them. But we do not sacrifice you and Eleanor to protect his memory." Harrison nodded. "Dad would have wanted us to fight. He would have wanted us to protect you." He reached out and took Caroline's hand. "Whatever Preston releases, we will survive it. Together." Caroline looked at her brothers, at the men who had dropped everything to protect her, who had risked their reputations and their businesses, who refused to abandon her even when the cost was their father's legacy. She made her decision. "Let him release it," she said. "I am done being afraid." The courthouse was packed on the morning of the custody hearing. Reporters lined the steps, cameras ready to capture every moment. Preston arrived in a tailored suit, his lawyers flanking him like bodyguards. He smiled for the cameras, shook hands with supporters, played the role of concerned father perfectly. Caroline arrived through the back entrance, flanked by her brothers. She wore a simple navy dress and minimal makeup. She looked exhausted. She looked determined. Judge Patricia Winters presided over the hearing, a stern woman in her 60s with a reputation for cutting through nonsense. She surveyed the packed courtroom with barely concealed irritation. "This is a custody matter," she announced. "Not a circus. Any outburst will result in immediate removal." She turned to Preston's legal team. "You may begin." Preston's lawyer was a polished man named James Mitchell. He outlined their case with clinical precision. Caroline's history of emotional instability, her attempts to flee the marital home, the premature birth that resulted from her reckless behavior, the psychiatrist who had evaluated her and determined she was unfit. He painted a picture of a woman unraveling, a woman who posed a danger to her own child. When he finished, the courtroom was silent. Judge Winters turned to Caroline's table. "Your response." Caroline's lawyer, Margaret Foster, stood slowly. She was 72 years old, had practiced family law for 5 decades, and had a conviction rate that bordered on legendary. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of a woman who had seen every trick in the book. "Your Honor," she said, "my client is not unstable. My client is a survivor of domestic abuse." She clicked a button on her laptop. "May I present evidence?" The screen at the front of the courtroom flickered to life. The footage began. Preston grabbing Caroline's wrist, Preston screaming that she was worthless, Preston threatening to take her baby, Preston's hand around her throat, shoving her against the refrigerator. The courtroom whispered. Margaret let the footage play for 3 full minutes. Then she paused it on an image of Preston, face twisted with rage, hand raised to strike. "This," she said quietly, "is the man who claims my client is the danger." Preston's face had gone white. His lawyer was whispering frantically in his ear. Margaret continued, We have medical records documenting my client's injuries. We have financial documents proving Mr. Calloway committed fraud and forgery. We have testimony from Mrs. Edna Morrison, who witnessed the abuse firsthand. She turned to face Preston directly. And we have text messages showing that Mr. Calloway attempted to blackmail my client into dropping charges by threatening to release damaging information about her late father. Objection. James Mitchell shouted, "This is beyond the scope of the custody hearing." Judge Winters shook her head. Overruled. The character of both parents is directly relevant. She looked at Preston with undisguised disgust. Continue, counselor. Margaret presented the full case. 2 hours of testimony. Documents, witnesses, evidence that painted a damning portrait of Preston Calloway. When she finished, she turned to the judge. Your Honor, my client is not asking for anything extraordinary. She simply wants to protect her daughter from a man who has shown, repeatedly and on camera, that he is capable of violence. She wants to raise her child in safety. She wants the chance to be a mother. Judge Winters was silent for a long moment. Then she spoke. This court has seen many custody disputes, accusations and counter-accusations, parents using children as weapons. She looked directly at Preston. But I have rarely seen evidence as clear and as damning as what has been presented today. She shuffled her papers. I am granting full custody of Eleanor Grace Whitmore to her mother, Caroline Whitmore Calloway. Mr. Calloway is prohibited from contact with the child until further review. Additionally, I am recommending that the county prosecutor pursue criminal charges based on the evidence presented. The gavel fell. Carolyn felt her brother's hands on her shoulders, heard Margaret's quiet words of congratulation, saw Preston's face crumble as the reality set in. She had won. But she did not feel victorious. She felt tired, hollow, as if she had been running for months and finally stopped. Is it really over? She whispered. Harrison squeezed her shoulder. Yes, it is really over. Caroline closed her eyes. For the first time in years, she let herself breathe. 6 months later, Caroline stood at the window of her childhood bedroom in the Whitmore estate, watching autumn leaves drift across the lawn. Eleanor slept in her arms, warm and peaceful. Her tiny hand curled around Caroline's finger. So much had changed. Preston Calloway had been convicted on charges of financial fraud, forgery, and assault. He was serving 12 years in federal prison. His assets had been seized. His business partners had fled. His name had become synonymous with disgrace. Sloane Hartwell had testified against him in exchange for immunity. She lost her career anyway. The video of her smiling while Preston threatened his pregnant wife had gone viral. No company would hire her. Last Caroline heard, she had moved to Arizona and was working as a receptionist at a dentist's office. Mrs. Morrison had become Eleanor's unofficial grandmother. She visited twice a week, bringing homemade cookies and stories about the old days. She had finally found peace. She told Caroline, 50 years of guilt had lifted the moment she helped save a mother and child. The photo of Judge Robert Whitmore accepting the envelope had been released. As Preston had threatened, an investigation followed. The truth emerged slowly, painfully. Her father had not accepted bribes. The envelope had contained evidence of judicial corruption by another judge, evidence Robert Whitmore had been gathering for a federal investigation. The man in the photo had been an FBI informant. The entire interaction had been documented and approved by the Justice Department. Her father had been a hero, not a criminal. Preston had not known the context, had only seen the photo and assumed the worst. His final weapon had backfired spectacularly. The Whitmore brothers had used the attention to launch the Caroline Whitmore Foundation, an organization dedicated to helping survivors of domestic abuse. They provided legal aid, safe houses, and escape planning for women in situations similar to Caroline's. In its first 6 months, the foundation had helped over 200 families. Carolyn herself had returned to law, not corporate law, not the high-powered career she had once envisioned. She now worked as a pro bono attorney for domestic violence survivors, using her experience to help other women escape their prisons. It was harder work than anything she had done before, less prestigious, less lucrative, and infinitely more meaningful. Eleanor stirred in her arms, making the soft sounds of a baby transitioning between dreams. Carolyn looked down at her daughter's face and felt her heart expand with love so fierce it was almost painful. You will never know what I went through to bring you here, she whispered. and I hope you never have to learn. But if you ever face darkness, remember this: you come from a family that fights, a family that protects its own, a family that never, ever gives up. Eleanor opened her eyes. They were blue like Caroline's, bright with curiosity about the world. Caroline smiled. Ready for breakfast, little one. She carried her daughter downstairs to the kitchen, where Mrs. Morrison was already preparing pancakes. The smell of coffee and maple syrup filled the air. "There are my girls," Mrs. Morrison said warmly. "How did the little princess sleep like a princess?" Caroline replied. She settled Eleanor into her high chair and accepted a cup of coffee gratefully. The back door opened and her brothers filed in, loud and argumentative and wonderful. Harrison was complaining about a board meeting. Bennett was showing Cole something on his phone. Cole was laughing at whatever it was. Typical Sunday morning chaos. Caroline watched her family and felt something she had almost forgotten how to feel. Peace, belonging, home. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. She tensed automatically. Old habits died hard, but when she opened the message, she saw it was from a woman named Sandra, someone she had helped 3 months ago, a mother of two who had escaped an abusive husband in New Jersey. The message read, "I just wanted to thank you. My kids are safe. I am safe. I started a new job last week. I could not have done any of this without you. You saved my life." Caroline felt tears prick her eyes. She typed back, "You saved yourself. I just helped you see that it was possible." She set down the phone and looked around the kitchen. At Eleanor smearing banana across her face, at Mrs. Morrison flipping pancakes, at her brothers arguing about who had the better golf swing. This was her life now. Not perfect, not without scars. She still woke up some nights in a cold sweat, convinced she heard Preston's footsteps on the stairs. She still flinched sometimes when men raised their voices. She would probably be in therapy for years, but she was alive. She was free. She was surrounded by people who loved her, and she was using her pain to help others escape theirs. That, she had learned, was the real victory. Not the court ruling, not Preston's conviction, not even the foundation bearing her name. The real victory was choosing to keep going, choosing to rebuild, choosing to turn her darkest chapter into someone else's first ray of hope. Caroline picked up her coffee and walked to the window. The autumn sun was rising over the hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber. Eleanor laughed at something Mrs. Morrison was doing with the pancakes. Harrison and Bennett and Cole continued their debate, voices rising and falling like waves. Life went on, and Caroline, for the first time in years, was ready to live it.